We want to gain a basic understanding of appraisals and appraisal review processes, develop an understanding of the difference between funding and treasury reg appraisals. That has important impacts on efficiencies. Develop an understanding of the appraisal review processes and common errors found in reviews. Identify potential opportunities for increasing efficiencies in the appraisal process. And I think that's where we're going to lean on the audience for participation, and hopefully we'll get into some robust discussions here. And finally, discuss the appraiser capacity issues and identify potential strategies for expanding appraiser capacity. And again, I think a lot of audience participation there will help as well. So without further ado, I'll tell you a little about myself and then introduce the rest of the panel. I appreciate the panel. We've had a number of calls, and I'll try to work through some of these issues, and I appreciate all the time and effort that they put into it. And I'd like to thank Caitlin and Hannah. They've done a great job of shepherding us through this, getting us prepared for this session. So my name's Kevin McCarty. I'm a real estate appraiser, have been for 38 years. It's kind of hard for me to admit that I've been in it that long, so I am that old, unfortunately. And I've been doing conservation easement work for about 25 years. McCarty Land and Water Valuation, we have 4 associates. Delaney's here, Delaney Dreckman, Shiloh Whitler out of Eagle County. Betsy Wagner lives in Lyons, does a lot of conservation easement work in the Front Range foothills. And then Matt Getz is another associate of mine in Laramie. So anyway, glad to be here, and I'll let the rest of the panel introduce themselves.
My name is Kevin Shea, and I am now a reformed appraiser. I don't do appraisals for conservation needs anymore. I do only reviews. And so I've been doing it for a long time. I have background being a Fed. I was a Fed. I was chief appraiser for Western Area Power Administration, string and wires. So it's a little, I did condemnation. So I've done some pavement and I've done some saving. And so basically I've got a lot of background, did acquisitions for Boulder County and for Jefferson County. So I've got a little bit more diverse background than a lot of other folks who are in the appraisal business. And I've been doing it for about 40 years, and I've been doing conservation in the South for about 30 years-ish. And so that doesn't, and even when I was at Fed, I was reviewing appraisals at that point. So primarily review now, do some consultation. And typical clients would be GOCO, land trust, CPW, that sort of thing.
Yeah, Hi everyone, my name is John Gioia. I work at the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust and serve as our Director of Transactions. Been at CCALT for about 2.5 years, and also previously lived in Colorado getting my undergrad and graduate degrees, but immediately prior to working at Cattlemen's, I was in my home state of Massachusetts doing land conservation there. Some of you may know Massachusetts has a unique situation where the state has this oversight role of any conservation easement that eventually gets recorded. Every single one needs to be signed off on by the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs. So that is the program I was involved with. I got to be involved with lots of different conservation easements, from literally easements that were under 100 square feet to like the largest conservation easements in the state, which were just a few hundred acres. So a much different landscape out there, but pretty interesting work then to bring out here in Colorado.
Good. Hi, I'm Sara Streight, and I'm an attorney. I'm not going to tell you how long I've been practicing, though, so you don't want to guess. But I have been working in the conservation field for about almost 20 years, I think. Started off as doing reviews for law firm that had a lot of clients who bought tax credits in the old days before you had certificates and all the things. And then kind of fell in love with it and decided that I wanted to work on the landowner side as well. So started representing landowners, and then over the past 6 or 7 years have started doing a lot more review work again on behalf of tax credit brokers or one tax credit broker. So that's kind of my practice in the conservation world. And I'm going to keep it short so we don't run over on time.
Nice. I like it.
All right. Do I need that thing?
Yeah.
Thank you.
so. For the video recording.
Attach it to something.
Or just set it up there.
Okay. All right. That's good. All right. So, we thought that, the perspective that I am going to bring to this panel from the land trust or easement holder grantee side of things, to kind of provide this perspective of working with the appraiser, kind of coordinating the appraisal process throughout the conservation easement transaction, kind of coordinating other, basically as project managers do, coordinating kind of all of those aspects of the transaction, primarily with the appraiser, is because that's kind of the focus of this session, but also thinking about like how other contractors and all the other pieces fit into that. So we thought it might be helpful just to kind of provide this like general overview, general guidance. I think the grain of salt to take it with is that, of course, every transaction is unique and like there's so many different like ways this could go. So these are just some of the things that we wanted to get into today in terms of like general flow, as far as the easement transaction and working with the appraiser is concerned. And yeah, thinking about those like opportunities for efficiencies. And so anyway, I was just going to run through these things, in your first kind of project development phase. This is like having your first phone calls or meetings with the landowner. You're developing understanding what the landowner wants to do, what their goals are, what they're trying to accomplish with a conservation easement, and basically like coming up with what the easements might look like, coming up with some scenarios, visiting with them, visiting the property, getting a feel for like what the whole thing is going to look like. I think like the first and second steps, appraiser consultation, often can and really should be maybe intertwined with each other, because it's at this stage, kind of early on, where you as the project manager, kind of like knowing, having this knowledge, you can identify potential appraisers, one or multiple appraisers that could be involved, and help the landowner identify who they may want to work with. And then start, getting that conversation going, connect the landowner with those people or with that person that may end up doing the easement appraisal, really to kind of bring them in early and help understand, like, are there any red flags that the appraiser could help kind of understand? Are there any red flags that you should be thinking about in terms of, your project structure, our contiguous family-owned property, one of our favorite things to think about with these transactions. Kind of like those things when you're sort of like vetting your scenarios, to bring the appraiser in early, I think is a great idea. And that, I've been working with Kevin McCarty we've been in touch for like, I don't know, over a year on a project that is like, hasn't even really gotten going yet, because we're still just trying to figure that out and figure out what kind of the best path forward is. So this is also like not always applicable, but if you're going to apply for funding, it's also a great way to, most funding applications got to have everything kind of figured out in terms of what your easement is going to look like. So maybe that, appraiser consultation might end up being a bit more of an involved process if you're going to apply for funding and the landowner wants to know like exactly what their easement value is going to look like. And so you go through more, like a phase one appraisal or a restricted appraisal, appraisal consultation kind of phase to get a much better picture of what that's going to look like. So yeah, you apply for funding, go through that whole process with your funder, get your project funded because it's a great project. And then you start, coordinating with the landowner to start lining out your due diligence and thinking about appraisal efficiency. You ought to always have like a timeline in place, and kind of have a goal in place for when all the different pieces are going to start coming together. And one of the last pieces is, of course, the appraisal. If you're doing a funded project, this is likely going to be two different types of appraisals. So you can kind of start at the end there, kind of lining that up with whenever your closing timeline is. And then you start contracting out your due diligence and timing that all out ultimately to have those things completed, whatever it is, whatever the funders are going to require. I mean, you're always going to have your baseline work and probably your mineral report and maybe some sort of phase environmental hazards assessment. And the goal there being that all of that will be completed by the time Kevin McCarty is going to deliver his funding appraisal to the easement grantee, to the landowner, and to Kevin Shea. So all of those parties can initiate their review, and actually probably Sara as well, if there's a tax credit broker involved at that stage. And then a couple other, I think what Kevin and Kevin are going to get into in much more detail, but this is kind of broken out here, is that you have your funding appraisal. This is, certain funders will require specific types of appraisals. Those, they'll have a specific date of value, May 9th, 2024. And that appraisal for the funders is good for 1 year. So you ought to be planning to close your easement within a year of that. And then you'll, of course, have your treasury appraisal, which the landowner can then use to obtain their tax benefits, which has a much shorter shelf life of, if it's delivered before you close the easement, you have 60 days to close on the easement, depending on when that date of value is. So those are a couple things you have to also think about in thinking about your timing, lining things up, working with your appraiser. Yeah, I think we'll get into some more details on efficiencies and coordination with contractors, but I know we have at least one baseline contractor in the room here, but having that communication between the landowner, land trust, and appraiser, the baseline contractor is often a critical component of that conversation and can feed a lot of important information to the appraiser as well. So that is a great person to kind of involve and be sure they understand how things are lining up as well. Hopefully that's a good stage setting for what you guys are getting.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, John.
The first thing is that I don't know where you guys know this, but today is International Donkey Day. So I thought that was important, and it was really important because they axed the slide that I had my donkeys on, and so I can't have any good ass jokes or anything like that because it isn't. But it is an International Donkey Day. So generally, the objective and purpose of the appraisal. I mean, that's where you kind of start. Generally it's for tax credits or deductions or support for various funders. Okay. Okay, there we go. Thank you so much. Technology or us. And so basically, depending on what the standard is, then you've got a different report. And so that's part of the discussion related to efficiencies. Because if you've got different footprints for different appraisals, it makes it much harder. So basically, in general terms, there's several different standards. One is the Yellow Book, Uniform Appraisal Standards for Uniform appraisal standards for federal land acquisitions, and that would be if you got some federal funding, and that's a more stringent standard. And then uniform standards for professional appraisal practice, which is USPAP. All appraisals have to comply with USPAP. That's kind of the base, and it's not really a hugely big standard, but it's something that everybody has to comply with. Then you've got Treasury regulations, NRCS. Everything has to comply with USPAP. And then the USFLA Treasury regs are additive. So the appraisal process. So the first thing is you got to define the problem. What are you doing, and why are you doing it? And so any unique constraints to the marketplace. You know, if you're in the San Luis Valley and you are in one of the water districts, I don't know why that's doing that. Then you've got to make sure that you're doing that in constraints that relate to that particular marketplace. And then you've got your scope of work. You have to decide what you're going to do to achieve the objective of delivering a credible appraisal. Then you got data collection and property description. And so you've got to be able to describe the property that you're appraising, the before value, if you will. What is the estate that's there? What does the landowner own there? So that's a big deal. So one of your first parameters is what you're appraising. So in USFLA or Yellow Book, you've got larger parcel. In Treasury regulations, you've got contiguous family-owned parcel. And then if you're just doing the CE area, you can just do a USPAP appraisal. So that gives you 3 different footprints of what you're appraising. So you got to figure out, so why are you doing this appraisal? And in Routt County now, and I think you guys have done a few of these, Kevin, I've done a couple of them, back when I was doing appraisals, you could do a Treasury regulation appraisal for funding purposes and give it to Routt County, and they would take that standard. And so that's helpful, because then you don't have to redo it to do the Treasury regulation appraisal down the road. And then the conservation easement area, if you're just doing, if the landowner has 2,000 acres and you're doing, 200 of that, then instead of having 1,000-acre sales, which presumably are cheaper, then you use 200-acre sales, which presumably are more expensive. So that helps the landowner monetize that. So you've got to look at what the standard is and what the footprint is, and that's a huge deal. Then you get to the review, and that's where I generally come in. I'd like to be on the front end of all that. GOCO's standard is that the appraiser and the reviewer talk before it gets too far down the road to where things are already so screwed up you can't deal with it. So that isn't exactly how that standard is written, but it's kind of like that. So standard 3 USPAP review, which is what I do, stays potentially within the 4 corners of the appraisal. The 4 corners of the appraisal means you're not doing stuff outside of the appraisal. You're looking at what's there. I always tell the appraiser that you're telling a story. You got to tell the complete story and get it done so that anybody who reads it can follow along and get to the same sort of conclusion that the appraiser does. So the 4 corners is theory and scope of the review. A USPAP reviewer cannot say that the value is high, low, or that it stinks. You just can't. Then if that happens, then all of a sudden the reviewer has to put on the hat of the appraiser. Totally different standard, got to do a bunch of different stuff. So the reviewer takes great pains at not saying your value sucks, because even though it may, and even though the question really is it supported? So is your value or other components supported or not? The non-appraiser reviewer has much more latitude, and that's Sarah's going to start on that.
Yep.
Yep.
You went way faster than we thought you were going to.
We thought that was going to take.
Okay, so then they've been haranguing me for months about how long I was going to take.
Nice work. All right. All right, is it going to work? Can you hear me all right? Oh, apparently not. Yeah. Okay. All good. Okay. So, yeah, I thought that was going to take Kevin longer, so I wasn't really thinking I was coming up so soon.
I can come back.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. So, as I said before, I am my role here. I may be representing the landowner, in which case I want to read the appraisal and do a review. But it's probably not to the same level that I'm doing a review as on behalf of the tax credit broker. So, let me just step back a little bit and explain to you what the process is at the Division of Conservation. And some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not. When there's somebody is trying to claim state tax credits for their conservation easement donation, they have to submit a whole application and supporting documentation to the Division of Conservation. And in order to do that, you have to have the recorded easement, you have to have the title work, you have the baseline, and you have to have the final appraisal with all of the supporting, the addenda and everything all completed. As the reviewer for the tax credit broker, I make sure that everything is in good shape and before the I'm sorry, my notes is running. Before the application can be submitted. Once the application is uploaded and all the documentation is sent in with the application fee, the Division of Conservation will send out a deemed complete letter saying that the application is complete, and now we're putting the application into our queue for review by one of their reviewers. And the reviewers the division has 120 days to complete their review of the application. Okay, so often when I come into the picture as a reviewer, unless it's a funded deal where Kevin Shea or somebody else has already looked at it, I might be the first person who's not really involved in the transaction who is reading the appraisal. So I'm reading it with a fresh set of eyes, and often I am able, because I'm doing that, I'm not familiar with the transaction, I'm not familiar with all the players, and maybe the transaction has gone through multiple different iterations and it's changed. I can often see things that maybe don't follow. Like Kevin said, the appraisal, you should be able to read it, follow along, you get to the end, and the conclusion makes sense. Sometimes that doesn't happen because of various things, and that's where the reviewer is very important in that role. What I'm looking for, oops, did I do that? How do I switch it?
It just doesn't.
Differing review. Oh,
There you go.
okay, sorry. Maybe I didn't do that. No. Okay. So what I am looking for, and when I sit down with the appraisal, I actually have all of the addenda there. I have my calculator there. I have the title work. I have the deed. I have the baseline, and I read all of it hopefully before I read the appraisal. But I start at the first page and I read all the way through to the last page, and I check all the math as I'm going through it. I check to make sure that there aren't any factual errors, that what the appraiser thinks the deed of conservation easement says, the deed of conservation easement actually says, because that can have an impact on the value. I make sure there's no transcription errors, that they haven't put one number on the front end or in the transmittal letter and have a totally different number in the conclusion or the summary of salient facts. And it just happens because the appraisal goes through multiple different versions before it gets to me. All the Treasury Reg requirements need to be in the appraisal before it goes in. As I think Bill and Kevin McCarty, I think, are the only two active appraisers, Delaney here. the division looks for those treasury reg requirements, and they will kick an appraisal back out to you if it doesn't contain all of that. We're trying to make the process more efficient for appraisers, so we don't want them to have to look back at an appraisal they wrote 6 months ago when the division notices that there's an issue when they do their review. So if I can tell them ahead of time, or when I do my review, that the treasury regs say, and I thought I had it written down, but there's they have to have a series of declarations and certifications. They have to have the correct definition of fair market value. They have what was I saying? I think John mentioned that for a treasury reg appraisal, if it's completed before the conservation easement is recorded, then it has to be within 60 days. The date of the effective date of the report has to be within 60 days of the day that the easement is actually recorded. And if it's dated the day of, what was it? We had a strange situation where the appraisal was dated the day the easement was recorded, and the division came back and said, you need to change all of your things. It's no longer an advanced report. It's now a retrospective report. So that's just a little story, something that happened. But did they appraise the right property? Kevin Shea talked about that. If it's a treasury reg appraisal, they have to appraise the contiguous family-owned property. So any property that's owned by the landowner plus any related parties or family members for contiguous family-owned property. Sometimes if there's a funding appraisal first and then they roll it into a treasury reg appraisal, maybe they don't catch the difference and they're appraising the wrong property. And so as a reviewer, I tell them, hey, you didn't you didn't appraise the right property here. Let's see. Hypothetical conditions. They have to have in there they have to list all their hypothetical conditions and extraordinary assumptions. The main one that has to be in every report is if the report's completed ahead of the conservation easement being recorded, then there has to be a hypothetical condition that the conservation easement is in place in the after condition. I think I said that right? That makes sense. Okay, yeah. So, okay. Kevin said that he, as an appraiser reviewer, is limited in what he can say in the review, as either the attorney for the landowner or the tax credit broker. I'm really trying to maximize the tax credits that the landowner is able to claim, or tax benefits, while also not raising any red flags with the IRS or the Division of Conservation. So I can go back to the appraiser and say, I read this from start to finish. Your conclusion didn't really seem supported by what you said in the report. And maybe the appraiser says, most of the time the appraiser says, my conclusion is my conclusion. And that's fair. I'm not an appraiser. I don't want to tell them how to do their job. But I do want to say, hey, I just read this appraisal. It didn't make sense to me. Maybe it won't make sense to the Division of Conservation or the IRS. And so let's figure out how you can further support whatever your conclusion is. Maybe add more data here. Maybe just add an explanation of why you concluded what you concluded. I think kind of all those things. Does the conclusion make sense? And maybe there are times when I get to the end and I say, I think your value is too high. I don't think you've got the data here to support the value that you conclude. So can you find some more data that will support that? Or do you need to lower the value? And that's never popular. But you know, we don't want to raise red flags. We don't want the division to have to kick an appraisal or an application out or to reject an application. So that's kind of what my role is. I think we're going to talk about errors, common errors. Do you want to do that? Is that next?
Karen feeding of reviewers.
Oh, okay. Do you want to do that with me? Or?
Yeah, I
Okay.
do.
I'll just stand next to you.
More than anything.
Yeah.
So, Karen feeding of reviewers. So basically, the best thing is you need to give us a beer. No, I mean, that's
No.
not what we do. You have to, the reviewer is actually your friend. I mean, to have the review, and I was talking to Bill earlier, and, you know, to have the reviewer come in and say, you know, you should maybe bolster this part of your report or bolster the other part of your report, that's really good for the appraiser. Especially good appraisers are always happy to see the review. Now, there are some appraisers which aren't good appraisers, and they hate to see the review because we're saying, dude, or dudette. Really? Really? You know, can you give me more here? And so that's a thing. So what you want to do is get the reviewer on board early before it's, you know, it's too late. And so, and then providing any information about any change in plans. Because what happens a lot of times, and Sara talked about this, is that, you know, what happens is that, you know, the appraiser has in his addenda, conservation easement iteration 2, and we're on iteration 5. And so you got to make sure that everything is consistent, and you got to make sure that the additional change in plans are good. And make sure the reviewer has most recent iteration of the appraisal baseline. I've reviewed many appraisals that aren't the current appraisal. And it's like, you know, so you want me to do this again now? Because now you're giving me the right one? One of the things that I do that Sara was also talking about is that I always start from the back. Read the conservation easement, read the baseline, so that I've got really good information about the property. And Matt's in the back, he's a baseline guy. And it's like, you know, if I can get a good baseline and look at that, then I have a much better idea of the property on the front end. And so that's a big deal.
I had something I wanted to say. I meant to say this about figuring out what the CFOP, contiguous family-owned property, is. And I think John actually touched on this in his little talk earlier. Everybody needs to ask the landowner over and over whether they own anything else that's contiguous, right?
Did you buy anything in the last 2 months?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
yeah, I just forgot to tell you. I bought this other 200 acres.
Right.
So now you're praising the wrong footprint.
Right. And or for a long project, maybe in the end, you know, since it started and they initially talked to the appraiser, they bought something, or their son bought something, or their dad bought something. So we're trying to, the whole point of this presentation today is increasing efficiencies. And it's not efficient if the appraiser has to rewrite his report or her report because somebody forgot to tell them that they bought 40 acres nearby. So I think when there isn't an attorney involved, or if it gets to me as as the tax credit broker reviewer, often it's too late and the appraiser is going to have to rewrite their report if I find out that there's extra property. And I ask the landowner before I start reading the appraisal, just so that I know when I get there what to expect, what to think that the appraiser is going to say about contiguous family-owned property. But I think it would be really helpful that if the holder or whoever's working on behalf of the holder can ask that question over and over and over and make sure they understand what you're asking.
Yeah, and I'm getting the hurry up
Oh, are we?
thing.
Hurry up, I said 5 minutes.
Oh, we're doing great.
So basically what I'm going to talk about.
Oh, we got to do our errors, yeah.
So, you know, and we're here. I mean, one of the biggest things is trust me. There's no basis for adjustments, no basis for your highest and best use, nothing, any of that kind of stuff. I mean, you're writing in effect a novel, and it should not be a flippin' mystery at the end. You know, it ought to be pretty factual. You ought to be able to get there with everybody else. And then Sara talked about errors in the transmittal, summary statement of the facts, or conclusion paragraphs. I can't deal with that. You know, if you say that the value is X on page 5 and Y on page 10, that ain't working.
you know, and it isn't working for the division either.
Right.
And so, and then also not reporting both your before and after highest and best use. I see that all the time. You know, they'll say, yeah, it's embedded in some paragraph somewhere where they say, well, yeah, I said it on page 48. Well, give me a conclusion and tell me where the damn conclusion is. And then inadequate discussion of the before state, you know, that's a big factor. And then, you know, what do we talk about so far a lot here is water issues. You know, if you use a water expert and you take that engineering number and you use that engineering number rather than the value in the market number, that's just not right. And so we've seen that in a lot of different places. And then for a treasury regulation, no discussion of enhancement. Not analyzing the pending agreement for sales. That's a GOCO standard, and it's also use path. I mean, that's base information. And even though you say, well, gee, the funder is going to maybe, you know, buy this as a bargain sale. Well, that's data. So put that data in there. And, you know, if it's contingent upon the appraisal, you know, that's fine. Just tell me what the hell it is. Inconsistent math, time adjustments are problematic. Everybody does them differently. You know, I use my fingers and toes to count months. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so it's like, you know, those are sort of challenging. Inadequate certification, and you talked about that earlier. I mean, you know, treasury regulation and you know, USPAP, you've got to have the right certifications in there. And if you don't have it, then it's not going to be acceptable. Disclosure of client and intended user, and inconsistencies between your sales sheets, your spreadsheets, and the narrative. If your sales sheet on addenda page 48 says that it was, you know, $2,812 an acre, and your sales sheet says it's, you know, $1,800, that ain't working.
Right. Just one other quick one, and this is, none of the appraisers in here have done this, but because I read so many appraisals, sometimes I'll be reading an appraisal and realize that some of the boilerplate or is describing a totally different transaction. And I get it. These reports can be 300 pages and have so much in it that I think that, you know, nobody wants to reinvent the wheel, but sometimes they do, or they don't reinvent the wheel, but they reuse the report or parts of the report, and so that is a common error that I have seen. You're up.
I call that having the Smith appraisal and the Johns appraisal. You know, so that's really. So the other thing you use as land trust, and the division has one, and Department of Interior has one, is spreadsheets. And I've got spreadsheets. A lot of the land trusts have asked me for my spreadsheets, and I've given them to them. You know, it allows you to have a systematic methodology to say, is it in there? You've got a standard, have you met it? The Department of Interior has got a really, really good yellow book spreadsheet that's got a discussion of must, shall, and should. Must and shall are strong words. It means you gotta. Should means you probably should, but if you don't, we're not gonna kill you. Whereas must and shall, they're liable to go ahead and shoot you.
Yeah, let me say. So I meant to mention this earlier, and Kevin just did, but I call these checklists. So I didn't know what he was talking about when he said spreadsheets. But the Division of Conservation actually publishes their checklist, both for the appraisal and for conservation values on their website. So if you're wondering what the division wants to see in an appraisal or in the documentation, it's on their website. And they actually have, for instead of must and, if it's must and shall, it says it has to be in there. Best practices means it should be there, but they're probably not going to reject it because of that.
My turn?
Yeah.
Okay, I guess.
Did we do good?
I don't want to sit down, Kevin, but I will.
Sneak behind you, Dan.
So, do we have an appraiser capacity issue in this state? Yeah, I agree. We do. And thanks. And what's the consequence of having an appraiser capacity issue? Do we have appraisers doing assignments that they maybe shouldn't be doing? been a little of that going on, I think. And I think our appraiser, and we'll get into the appraiser capacity issue a little more here in a bit, but I think it's kind of lost my train of thought there. I think it's a geographic issue too, especially. I mean, I think there's some places in the state where it's a more severe problem than others. I think in some of the places we work, we can handle it. But there's been some retirements in some areas, and it's a real problem, I think. And I think addressing those problem areas is one of the things we'll probably talk about here in a little bit. But the appraiser capacity issue does give rise to appraisers getting hired just because they're the only one that'll take the assignment. So what can you, as other conservation professionals, land trusts or attorneys or even tax credit brokers, what can you do to assist landowners in trying to evaluate who they're going to hire? Geographic competency is a big one. I mean, just because you have a history in doing conservation easement assignments doesn't mean you're competent to work in a specific area. It's good to have competency in doing conservation easements because there's a lot of things about a conservation easement appraisal that obviously our reviewers have talked about that if you don't have that experience, you're probably going to miss. So ideally, you want to have someone with that competency in doing conservation easements, but it's every bit as important, maybe more so, to have the geographic competency. So I think when you're helping a landowner evaluate who they're going to hire, I think it's an important question to ask: how many appraisals have you done in this market area, and how recently have you done them? And if they haven't been doing that work, then they need to make themselves geographically competent. And the best way to do that is to team up with an appraiser who does have that geographic competency. There's places, I've been doing some water work in the San Luis Valley. I would never work there alone. I have an associate that I work with there, and he wouldn't be able to do the conservation easement assignment by himself. I wouldn't be able to do a competent job if I didn't have his geographic expertise. So, I just can't stress enough the importance of geographic competency beyond just the experience in doing conservation easements. And, beyond that, I think you have to, find out if they have the appropriate education. The Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraiser chapter, we provide a lot of on-point rural appraisal education. And, we've had a couple of water rights conferences. There's, one thing that really bugs me is appraisers saying, well, I don't do water. Well, find another state to work in then if if you don't do water in Colorado. So, it's just important to vet these appraisers when they're being hired, and land trusts in particular on the front line that are helping these landowners find an appraiser. I think it's important that you really help them through the process and make sure that they're hiring the right appraiser or appraisers that can do the job right and understand not just conservation easement appraisal, but understand the market area within which they're working. So I think we're ready to get into the fun part of this and start talking about actually having a panel discussion and engaging the audience here. I'll go over here so it won't seem like I'm more important.
You are.
Well, you
Oh,
are.
well, okay.
You
I was just fishing for that actually.
Yeah, I know. I know.
So
Do we have?
let me
Can somebody
see.
Click over.
What-
Do we have the-
Yeah, where are we at here? Yeah, it's just a heading is all we're here
Yeah,
with
well,
now.
but it's a really pretty picture.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We like really pretty pictures.
So we got to do that. So one of the first things, we're going to have kind of two parts of the panel discussion. First, we're going to talk about seeking efficiencies and processes, and then we'll get back to talking about appraiser capacity a little bit. But one of the trickiest things I think land trusts and appraisers deal with are these initial valuation discussions. And, how do we, do an appraisal without doing an appraisal from the appraiser's standpoint? And then, John's sitting across the table from the landowner, and they're saying, well, what are you going to pay me? How do you answer that question? And I don't, it's tough.
It's yeah, that is definitely absolutely one of like the first questions that comes up. I don't know, is this working? Can people hear me? Yeah, that one's working.
I think we've
Yeah.
confused it now. Maybe that needs to go over there.
Let's just talk loud.
Do you need it?
You're all out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you need it to be? No, actually, I'm looking behind you. Yeah, sorry.
Big mic, I'm not sure. The small one, if somebody can clip that on. Yeah, it's kind of in the center.
And then we just huddle together.
Clip it on. The big mics, I'm not sure. They go up.
Yeah, we're going to be talking back and forth here. It's
Yeah,
going to be hard
we can just
Yeah.
enunciate.
Well, we can just hand the little one back and forth.
Yeah, we'll do that.
John, you just go with it.
Okay. Where were we talking about?
With the land.
The appraiser.
Yes,
lesson,
I mean it's when I have a phone call with the landowner. I mean it is pretty much, and I guess most of you that are doing easement transactions would feel the same way. But it's like one of the first questions you'll get talking to someone that's interested in doing an easement is, what does this look like financially? Like what could I end up getting out of it? And that's not to say like most of the people that we end up working with are motivated to conserve their land also, and they have that as like a primary goal of what they're looking to do. And sometimes they are just kind of willing to, they say, I'm sure there will be some value here, but my main motivation is conservation. But oftentimes like they need to have some sort of assurance of what they're going to get out of it. Maybe they are looking for they have a certain specific financial goal, like with a funded deal to, do a 1031 exchange and expand their holdings or their ranch or, whatever. So that is when we kind of like think about how can you give some clarity to a landowner. And that is sort of like a gray area, and what I think would be helpful to talk about a little bit, because we, as the land trust, I want to be very respectful of the standards that appraisers are held to. Like, yeah, they can't provide the appraisal without actually providing the appraisal, but there may be some areas and ways that they could help just kind of let you know if you're in the right sort of ballpark. So we do work across the state. One of the things that we will do when scoping things out and thinking about potential easement values is, of course you have to know like what is the landowner, what are their goals, what are they looking to do with the conservation easement, because whatever their reserve rights are, however much land they're looking to encumber, that of course is always going to dictate the value. And we can, at least our process, we can look at kind of recent work that we've done in the area and just begin to get a general idea. Maybe the landowner has also bought their land recently, they've acquired their land recently, or they've had some sort of bank appraisal that you can look at sort of as a benchmark. All those things kind of go together to maybe lead into some of these initial discussions with the appraiser that may end up being a good fit, that has the geographic competency that you as the land trust or the easement holder would maybe kind of recommend that the landowner consider working with. And that kind of feeds into maybe some of these initial discussions.
Do you think sometimes how do you avoid going down too many rabbit holes?
Pick it up.
How do you avoid going down rabbit holes? I mean, how do you screen for knowing that it's, unrealistic financial expectations?
Right. Um, I guess that like if that often is a challenge where people just have a certain expectation, or they think their land is worth more than it is basically what it is. That can like pretty quickly become kind of a difficult conversation to have. Because then in this, you do kind of get into a position where we are trying to talk about maybe some kind of technical appraisal things, because they only want to encumber a portion of their land, and well, that's going to affect their easement value. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't have a good answer of how to, like, rabbit holes are hard to avoid.
Were you going to say?
No.
Well, I'm going to say what you guys do. So, so I'm going to switch over to my landowner representative or attorney for the landowner hat. I have some clients who I'm working with, Betsy Wagner, who's one of Kevin's associates or appraisers. When we had the initial conversation with the land trust says, we think it's worth a lot, but we have no way of knowing how much it's worth. And I am their attorney. I don't have any way of knowing what it's worth, but we don't want to go down, go too far down the path until we can get an actual reasonable idea or ballpark figure. And so some of the appraisers, Kevin's firm being one of them, will do a consultation. And they don't do it for free. The landowner has to pay them, but at least it gives everybody a number to start from that's maybe in the ballpark. Is that?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, the challenge for us as appraisers, the moment we start providing numbers, we've done an appraisal. And, so it's a slippery slope for us to try to do that. But, we don't want to tag somebody with a $20,000 appraisal and find out there was unrealistic expectations. So that's sort of this tightrope we're walking and trying to, get to a point where, people have a general idea on where it's going. And we want to do that as quickly as we can to identify. I guess I always say we know we can tell somebody what the number isn't. We just can't tell them what the number is, So, it's a good idea to, kind of understand what the expectations are. But, I guess that thing and some of this, everybody kind of chime in on, their experiences too. How do we, kind of eliminate those rabbit holes? And it wastes the land trust time, it wastes our time that we could be working on another project. So it's really important to identify those deals that, because of elevated expectations, we shouldn't be wasting our time on.
Yeah, and everybody's had those deals, and if the guy shows up in the big black Tahoe with a driver that's packing as his personal bodyguard, then my defenses go up immediately, and it's not because I think they're going to shoot me until I get the appraisal done, and then back when I was doing appraisals, that was always a big red flag. It's like, okay, well, hold on, this guy may not have the conservation intent. And that's a big thing, if the landowner's got a big conservation intent, that's a little bit easier. The market isn't, they're not gonna bail because instead of making 700,000, they're gonna make 600 or 550 or something.
So are there any, observations, questions from the audience? I mean, I'm sure everybody's kind of had some of these experiences, and I don't know if any.
What about a discussion with an appraiser about just sales data?
I think that's important. I was sitting here thinking about that too. Is there something that we as appraisers can do to kind of feed data to the land trust to kind of help, give some parameters to what you're talking about?
And the discussion just was from John. How about generating sales, getting sales from the appraisers, and that's a good methodology.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying like you just give like here's what properties in your area are selling for, or I mean,
or sale
Okay.
write-ups, or I guess some of
Pick
it.
that up.
Yeah, some of you probably use existing appraisals, I assumed, as a guide to what may happen on another property. So, yeah, maybe that's, one of the answers to this is that just communication and actually sharing that data, with the land trust to put you guys in a little better position to, sort of talk to them about value.
Yes.
Yeah, just, what's your thoughts on engaging like a competent real estate agent to just do a CMA analysis, sales in the area? Would that be?
Yeah,
something that work out? You know, don't work for free, but
right. I think if they're competent and know the market well enough, they'd have to be a good.
Yeah, if you're using
appraiser.
if you're using a legitimate ranch broker, and there's tons of them around that are really good, then that's a different thing than if you ask somebody who works for Century 21 to come in and do your analysis.
Yeah.
One of the tricky things there, I mean, that I guess that could work to get a landowner an understanding of what their property is worth. And then the challenge is like, what's the property going to be worth after the conservation easement is recorded, which that person probably doesn't have the expertise to look at that, but at least they can give you, that first vision of it.
And the other thing is, when you look at that, and then, all of us in the appraisal business have had transactions where we've started and there's going to be one reserved right and it's over here. Then as life goes on, all of a sudden it's two reserved rights. Then maybe it's three reserved rights. Well, that makes a huge difference in what the net value is for the conservation easement. So again, it ends up being a sliding scale. So can we now do about? I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about having other help, mapping,
Yeah,
baseline, that sort of thing.
That's a good segue. Let's
Okay.
move on. Just before we move on from that, I think this is just, hopefully it's piqued everybody's interest. We need to continue this conversation. I think there's some real opportunities for, improving efficiency because of this.
just real quick before moving on, Colorado Open Lands and one of our landscapes, we've been able to obtain grant funding from a family foundation to give us $10,000 or $15,000 or $20,000 that we can use to pay for a restricted analysis or some sort of consulting thing, with the caveat that if the landowner doesn't like the values, they don't move forward. They don't have to pay us back. But if they do move forward, they pay us back. We've been able to kind of keep this revolving fund of money. It doesn't take much, but it's certainly some fundraising required.
Yeah, thanks. That's good. All right. Go for it.
I think, didn't we also have, one of our thoughts was like only, I mean, maybe this is what we're about to talk about, only pursuing projects that are likely to come to fruition. Yeah. So, I mean,
Right. Make every bullet count. That's what
right.
we all kind of need to do that.
Right. And I think, I don't know where it is in our slideshow, but we were talking about, we're limited in the number of appraisers who are able to do this. And we have a list of the appraisers that we're aware of who are doing conservation easement appraisals. And we don't want them to be wasting their time and resources on projects that aren't going to close, aren't going to be done when they only have so many, days in a year that they can be working. So.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, we're going.
So let's talk about a little bit about appraiser efficiencies. One of the reasons why I'm not doing any more appraisals is because I don't have the capacity to crank out an appraisal myself now. I need somebody to help me do Word, to help me, pull maps in, to do mapping. And, Kevin has been very successful at finding people who are doing mapping for him. And the baseline, Matt's back there in the back, and, he's going to have good maps. There isn't a reason in the world why we can't all come up with a set of maps that everybody's going to agree on Because that's one of the things as a reviewer that just drives me absolutely insane is you've got a map from the baseline on page 14, a map from the land trust on page 28, and a map that the appraiser developed on, page 52, and none of them agree, So it's like, here's the property. But this polygon doesn't look the same as this polygon, And from a reviewer standpoint, that ain't going to work for me. Okay, so you've got to, I think there's some really, really good efficiencies that we can come to in mapping and base information. And if you get a good baseline from a competent baseline person, then that's going to give you a ton of information about the property as an appraiser.
Right. And we have a lot of duplication of effort at this point. Having 3 GIS people doing the same thing. We ought to be, sharing some of those shape files back and forth at the very least. We really need to bring the baseline people in fairly soon in the process. We always ask who the baseline person is. We want to be in touch with them right away and sharing information. If that baseline person is out there measuring buildings, I do not want to have to measure buildings too, And, there's just a lot of opportunities. I think title review is another one. We have a good mapper that somehow likes title review. I don't know. But anyway, but I think we're doing a lot of that. The land trust and us are both having to, do title review. Is there any way we can find efficiencies there? There's just a lot of things we're all doing.
I think one of the opportunities there, or something to identify early in the process, is to have one person who is managing that, so that the baseline preparer knows that the appraiser is going to be doing the mapping. But it shouldn't be the appraiser's job to be reaching out to all these people. I don't know who that person should be, but for each project, there should be one person who's in charge.
Yeah, and Matt, do you want to chime in here? Speak loud.
Land trust, to keep the charge on who's in charge of what and coordinating all the different subcontractors.
It's a project management question.
Yeah.
Okay, how are we doing the project management as best we can? And
It's probably going to be the first person to be in contact with the landowner, which is probably the land trust.
yeah,
I don't think I'd speak to that and say that the land trust is working with the landowner to build a vision for the property and the terms of the conservation easement. And so I think that generally is the place for that to be the coordination. But I do think that there are opportunities for us to think about efficiencies in terms of your time and everybody's. And some of the land trusts have full-time GIS managers, others don't. And so you've got to think about delegating that role depending upon what resources you have as the land trust.
yeah, and there's some, like you said, there's some land trusts don't have the staff, and so in that instance, maybe it's the baseline person who is going to be cranking out, the mapping, and there's, when I look at the baseline on the front end, that gives me so much information that it's really good, and it always astounds me sometimes that the appraiser doesn't have the baseline. Like, really? You're really going to do this appraisal without looking at the baseline? That is absolutely insane.
I think if I may just add to that point that Kevin made earlier, if you get everybody on the phone call initially, so that you are dividing and conquering, you're gonna save yourself a lot of conversations later, and that might even go to doing the site visit together too. So that you're doing it with the landowner, with the appraiser, with the baseline preparer, you're all on the same page. You can realize a lot of efficiencies in doing that. That's hard to do sometimes when you're talking about different geographies and different schedules, but to the extent that if you can at least kick it off together, I think you're going to do yourself a favor and do them a favor.
All right.
Yeah, I think that can help just avoid surprises that like you might see at some point if you're not involved earlier on. Like I mentioned, the project that you and I are working on together now, like we've been talking about, it's just a bit complicated, but we've been talking about it for many months about like what it will look like. So hopefully there are no surprises there, but yeah, like,
will be.
yeah, having having those baseline appraiser, landowner, easement holder together and on the same page early on, I think just like gets the ball rolling and like keep the lines of communication open. So like there's so many things if you are going to be the project manager and like the central hub of that like wheel. There's all these different spokes. Like you have to keep all of these people updated on so many different moving parts of the transaction. So yeah, it's
Project management software.
And brokers are thinking about this too, a lot of times, again. Yeah, agreed. We
Yeah.
coordinate sometimes with, with the appraisal, especially in the land trust, and say, hey, let's coordinate our comments, and sometimes we'll talk to baseline repair and, try to get everybody on the same page, or at least part of the same email chain, so everybody's in the loop.
Yeah. Do appraisers give you a heads up usually that an appraisal's coming, or?
If they know that I'm involved, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. That should be a
Yeah.
standard operating procedure.
Mm-hmm.
If I could add one thing too with the brokers,
Yeah.
getting them involved early as well, because particularly if
Yeah.
you're talking about a high value property that you might be phasing, or if you're thinking about timing something and we've already blown through the tax credit for this year and there's going to be a taxable event when they close on an NRCS deal or something like that. There's a lot of those implications that go beyond the purview of, say, a project manager or an appraiser or a baseline preparer, but get those folks in the room so that they're at least talking to the landowner, and then that landowner is talking to their tax professional, their accountant, their tax advisor, so that you can think about that, because that timing might be a pretty important issue. If they get $1 million NRCS payment, all of a sudden they don't have a tax credit to offset that liability. And so also, so getting them in early on, thanks for raising that point, is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So I think we'll keep moving on and spend a few minutes on appraiser capacity, and then I think we'll have 5 or 10 minutes at the end for a few questions here. Sorry to kind of interrupt. This has been this is what we were hoping for. Just a couple more things on efficiencies. I talked a little on the geographic competency issue. By engaging local appraisers, that can increase the increase the capacity of an appraiser. It's if I have help from somebody, a local appraiser that's going to put 60 hours into an assignment, I'm not going to have to spend as much time in it. So I think there's really some great advantages beyond the geographic competency issue. There's a capacity gain there too in dealing with local appraisers. Bundling projects in the similar market area, we've found some great advantages to that. We like to do that. One, it saves our clients money, but it also, I think, is good for everybody. You kind of get your head into it. You can, have less hours in each appraisal. We try to bundle it ourselves, but I think land trusts need to be thinking about that too, because I think there's some efficiencies there. And then there's some other ways that appraisers can be more efficient if they have editorial assistants, or, we talked about mapping assistants. So I just think there's a whole laundry list of ways that we can, find some efficiencies here. So anyway, that's my last comment on that section. So appraiser capacity. So do you have? Oh yeah. How many? This is a question. How many certified general appraisers do you think there are in Colorado? How many people think it's less than 250? How many people think it's more than 1,000? Well,
I didn't know.
No.
Oh, one. How about more than 2,000? 2,700 certified generals in Colorado, and we only have 8. I don't know. Yeah, we have a list in here, but it's surprising. But I think some of it is there's some intimidation and the history of it, and a lot of those people aren't rural appraisers, but it's tough to get into this business and have the competency, and it takes a long time to develop a good rural appraiser, and let alone into the conservation easement side of things. And it's hard to, take on a trainee, and it takes 5 or 6 years to get a certified general, and there's just a lot of roadblocks you know, to entry into this profession.
Well, and there are some potential likely suspects, if you will, for appraisal. Is if there's 2,700 uh, certified generals, I mean that's where you start, and so that's a good thing. But you've got to have somebody who's got some rural experience, probably, and then secondarily partial interest experience. So I came up through condemnation, and I did stuff like DIA and highways and that sort of thing. That's fractional ownership. So the right of way business is full of appraisers who've got fractional interest experience. So that's one pool that we can take a look at. But the other pool is like the farms FSA appraisers and those guys, the guys who are really, rural appraisers. And so that gives you another pool to try to help them. But then there's also the commercial appraisers who don't have either of those sort of experiences, who, if you're a commercial appraiser right now, the commercial business, I think the technical term is the commercial business sucks. And so it's very hard. It is a race to the bottom for fees. And it is a very, very competitive and hard business. And so there are commercial appraisers who may have enough smarts to figure out how to make the transition, but that isn't going to be anytime quick.
Yeah, I think what we can do here, as in the conservation community, is try to identify even just a few appraisers that are good candidates because of their educational background, because of their experience, and could be adaptable to be in conservation easement appraisers. And I think to do that, we first identify them, but then bring them in on assignments. We've had a guy named Clark Oman that's from Montrose that we've kind of identified. I'm going to work with him on a project this summer, and hopefully Kevin Chandler maybe work on a project or two with him. He's got a really good agricultural appraisal background. He's got good geographic competency. Those are the kind of people that, if you know somebody like that might be interested, then we get them into some of these projects. Now it's going to be a doubling up of appraisers. It's going to be more costly in these mentoring kind of appraisals to bring somebody in, but it's going to be worth it if we can, find the right people and do this.
Well, if there's 10 appraisers now, maybe, that are actually doing conservation easement work, if we bring one more in, that's huge. Yeah. I was going to get out my HP 12C, but I couldn't. Yeah.
So who's the we in this? Because in my organization, CPW, we did research a couple of years ago, and I have a list of every single appraiser licensed in the state of Colorado back then. And we dug through, we're looking. Where is anybody who has this specifically with the CEs? And it's a very small list. We all know that. And you say we, you're telling us in the conservation community, we have to bring them in, but you have to bring them in.
Well, we're trying.
And what is the organization that's going to do that? Like at CPW, we've talked with different appraisers in your very elite and experienced group, and some have said, I don't have time.
Yeah. There's that for sure.
There's that.
Yeah. And I probably have some time to do that. But I'm not sure that I don't have the capacity to crank out appraisals. So I'm sort of in a hybrid situation. I can do some teaching, but I can't support them nearly as much. Kevin has done a really good job of bringing people along. He's got a good shop. There are good people there, And, he's just done a really good job. I just don't have the capacity,
Mhm.
you know?
In this community help, we have voices and we have connections, maybe GoCo could get involved with us to help compensate.
I was gonna say,
Right.
funding is probably a big piece of it. If you
Right.
Maybe we can do that.
Pay-
Have you attempted to get funding before, Kevin? I know they
No.
have, but usually Gioia,
Yeah.
for trainees and stuff.
Oh, yeah, but I think specific project funding, an appraisal is gonna cost 30,000 rather than 20,000 because you're bringing in, paying for two appraisers.
But maybe there could be a fund that the different organizations or Keep It Colorado or whoever, sorry, Keep It Colorado, could, contribute to that could offset some of those costs for the landowners or the particular projects. It'd just be grant funding, I guess.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's a good concept.
No,
I'm willing.
Yeah.
To help, because I know it's an issue.
Yeah, identifying that appraiser that we want to do that is a big deal. We have the Colorado chapter of the Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers. We have 50 or 60 people in there, but a lot of them, just don't have an interest or their job wouldn't allow them because of, they're an organizational appraiser or something. But there's maybe a couple people in there that we have interest in. Besides Clark, there's a couple other people that we've been thinking about, but
Right.
but the list is not long.
No, it isn't, but it also doesn't have to be long to increase. If we collectively come up with a couple of likely suspects, if we get 3 more people
Mhm.
doing conservation easements now, that is huge. That is absolutely huge.
Mhm. What was that? Do we want to put up the list of people who are
Yeah, I think it's
accepting that? Yeah. Sorry. Make you keep working. Yeah. So those were the folks we identified as actively working in the state, and some of those are just like Clark Oman is, I don't think doing his own project.
Not yet.
And
We're working on it.
Lingle, right? John Lingle?
Yeah, he would never do one.
Yeah. He's going to do one.
Is he?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
But
So-
one on that list, Mark Federer, he's a really good land appraiser, and I convinced him to, do some. He's been doing some work for Malt and Estes Valley Land Trust. It's not a big part of his business, but he was a guy we identified and talked into. He's not going to solve the capacity issue, but he's going to take the load off of us in a few cases. So even if we find some guys like him that are, just wanting to stay in their immediate geographic area and we can get them up to speed, those kind of scenarios could help us a little bit too.
What is the process, like somebody that is very interested in this, they're certified general appraiser. They don't have any easement appraisal experience. Like what does that actually look like to get that person up to speed and like ready to take on assignments?
Well, one, I think they need to take a conservation easement appraisal course. That would be kind of fundamental. But I think teaming up with an experienced appraiser, and just going through the process is the best way to train them. And I don't think you can do it with one appraisal. I think you got to get a few appraisals under their belt, and
Well, you also got to have enough in the pipeline to keep them in the game, because I've got a guy who's has an interest in doing this, but he's doing right of way stuff, and he's making good money doing right of way stuff, so he's not seeing the wisdom of going into another genre and coming up with the amount of work that's necessary to be in the business. And the conservation easement appraisal business has been very, very good to me, and I think it's been very, very good to Kevin and the other Kevin and Bill. And there's it's a short list.
and don't get anybody else named Kevin, by the way. I think we're
Yeah,
We got enough, yeah.
yeah. No, I think we ought to find somebody. I think that ought to be a parameter. I think, guys,
So how long does if you're doing a conservation easement appraisal, how long does that generally take? Like once you have all your, you know what the parameters of the CE are going to be, that sort of thing.
I think some of it depends on if it's an area where we've worked in before and, how much sales research we have to do. In our office, we try, I try to keep my hourly rate out of it as much as I can because it does kind of load it up a little bit. But, it isn't uncommon to be thinking total staff and appraiser hours, 120 to 160 hours. It would be rare to see a conservation easement appraisal assignment where you're going to get everything done in less than 80 working hours.
Okay.
That's one thing that we do. And I think it's important that appraisers there's some financial incentive for this to happen. We charge by the hour. We'll do a flat fee or a max fee on the consultation phase. But when it comes to the appraisal, it's just so random as how many hours you get into it. We only charge by the hour. And, I think we should be like other professionals and get paid for our time, frankly.
Right.
And I think if that happens, if that becomes ingrained, then, I think it provides a little more financial incentive for other appraisers to enter into this field.
Mm-hmm.
The project managers for the land trust also be paid hourly.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that are facilitating.
You should.
Yeah. Go ahead and ask the boss that, because that ain't our thing. You got to ask your own boss for that. So yeah.
Yeah, so kind of general questions, anything,
Can I have one
Yeah.
thing? I talked to Mike Nash, who's not here, before, just telling him what we were going to be talking about today. And he had a proposal that I think you said has been discussed before that would help with efficiencies. And I wrote it down. Now I can't remember. That it would be helpful to the appraisers if there was a central database of all sales of conservation easement properties that have happened. That if somebody could collect that information, because the land trusts know when a conservation easement property sells, they could report it to Keep It Colorado or whoever, and then the appraisers could reach out and get that information without having to spend hours searching for it.
Well, and in fact, Peter Sartucci does that, but it's not necessarily totally complete, and you got to wait for Peter to get it done. And he's, he does a really good job, but any sales database is just the starting point. So basically you look at all that and you look at that and you've got to reconfirm all that stuff yourself to make sure that you're right. And so if you've got sales, if Kevin has sales in his database, he's already confirmed them. He knows they're good sales. But if you're getting sales from a database which is global, if you will, then that helps the hours that you need to spend doing the overall first cut, but it doesn't answer the question per se. But it definitely will help.
Just not having knowledge that the sale exists is really, I think, the function of what Mike is talking
Right.
about. And I agree with him,
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Oh, that would help us filter through some of those first questions and discussions. If we could access that as well, that'd be pretty remarkable, I would say.
Yeah, I think discussing the appraiser numbers is important, but I look at sort of the full picture, the attorneys that we use. I'd love to see a list of the 5 or 6 attorneys that we use. That's kind of scary as well. Baseline prepares as well. It's the whole system.
Yeah.
To take a look at and see what these numbers are. Where we need more folks.
This might be a really stupid question, but given when we're working with landowners, we've got the situation where somebody, a rancher down the road did a conservation easement 20 years ago, and they received 80% of fee title value for theirs. So why aren't we? And so that discussion happens. And I've been toying with the idea of percentages. So it's not 80% of fee title value anymore, but when we're talking about trying to have those initial discussions, would it be safe? Can you all in regions or in the state say, yeah, it's gonna be between 22 and 35%?
I think I think the problem there, it's so site specific, you know, it depends on the size of it depends, right, on so many factors, it's hard, but at the consultation stage, we do talk in terms of percent losses and say, look, you know, we know that, you know, similar properties have sold that, you know, are indicating these kind of ranges. So I think you about have to talk in terms of percent value losses initially. When we get to the appraisal, the percent loss is what falls out at the end. We do two appraisals before and after, and you know, and it's kind of a different story then. But I think in the initial stages, you almost have to talk in terms of what you think the approximate percent value loss is going to be, and you know, and with a lot of caveats saying this is what we think, but it may not be that.
Well, it may not be that because the deal changed too. You know, so that's one of the perils that I see as a reviewer, and you know, you can see that the even in the review phase, I can see that the CE changed from the initial appraisal, and they're trying to just try to keep as close as they can to that initial appraisal in the second appraisal when, you know, when the deal changed. And so I see that tension just within the reports.
A water-related question. Curious, Kevin, you mentioned early on that you don't like just seeing in a report that you're reviewing that if the appraiser took the water engineer's figures at face value. How do you But I guess the question is at what point do you really look at maybe taking the next step and valuing the water rights separately? I mean, it seems like there's one school of thought where you're just comparing wet ag properties with other wet ag properties, and that's good enough. But at what point is that not good enough, and you'd like to see kind of going on that?
Yeah, well, you know, we're charged with determining the value of the entire contiguous family ownership in treasury reg appraisals, at least. So it's the contributory value of that water, and the contributory value of a water right might be vastly different than if it were to sell separately. So, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, we're looking at what you'd put a sign up on that irrigated farm and what the whole thing would sell for, and what that water could sell for separately is definitely going to influence its contributory value to the farm. But at the end of the day, you know, we have to have that reality in there. And
Yeah, it's truly market value. And one of the things that I did when I did a few things in the Arkansas Valley, you know, a while ago, and one of the things that I had, and we had this water engineer who did all this stuff, and they came up with this value, and it was like a bazillion dollars, and you know, the water was worth a lot, but the question was, what was the water on the sales? So I asked them to go back and take a look at what the consumptive use he thought was going to be on these other sales. So it allowed me to stack the sales that gave a little bit more impetus to maybe what the water might have been worth, as opposed to just taking the guy's stuff hook, line, and sinker. I mean, you know, that just doesn't make any sense.
yeah, and it really depends on the functioning of the market. You know, if we're looking at something on the main stem of the South Platte where virtually every senior water right that's going to come up for sale is going to be purchased by a municipality, or, you know, or a speculator that's going to later sell to a municipality. You know, we have to get a consumptive use study done on those because it's going to sell on a consumptive acre foot basis. If we're doing something in a market that sells in a combined value, it sells on an irrigated acre basis, it may not be appropriate for us to assign a separate water value if that's not the way the market's functioning. So we're really being guided. Our valuation has to be guided by the functioning of the market in terms of its water rights.
Thanks.
Yeah, that is so exactly true. I mean, and all of, the appraiser thing as well, it depends. And so, it really does end up being, is it market based? We can talk about all sorts of theory and all sorts of jive, but the question is, the dude with the checkbook, what number is he going to write in that slot? Who's the guy who's the likely buyer, which is a yellow book standard. Yellow book standard says you got to tell me who the likely buyer is. So what's the what's the what's the likely buyer going to be doing, and how likely is that the guy's going to show up at a time that's going to make it. In all of my stuff in the Arkansas Valley, there was a couple of municipal sales, but there hadn't been any municipal sales for a while. So the fact that Aurora or somebody like that had paid $1 bazillion earlier doesn't necessarily mean that's going to happen right now. And so it is market based, and that's what everybody has to base things on. So it's a little bit hard to quantify just on a overall, well, gee, I think that it's 42% of the value is the water, not getting there.
So I think we've reached 4:30. Really appreciate everybody's engagement. This has been fun.